Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this community research webinar, the community sector and the collection of client-level data.
Thanks very much, Jan, and can I just echo from Convoice's point of view what a great pleasure it is to be doing this webinar, and big thanks to Community Research for facilitating it. It's a really important issue that's very much engaged the community sector, so great to have this opportunity to talk with a large number of people, so welcome everybody. Just to recap what's happened over the last little while with this issue. Back, I think it was in September, the budgeting services were going through a redesign process, and as part of that, the Ministry of Social Development included in their contract a requirement that they should, as part of those new contracts, gather up client-level data, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail, exactly what that was about. And at that time, it was signalled that it was expected that all contracts with the Ministry of Social Development would include this requirement by July 2017, which was the first any of us had heard about that in detail. Obviously there was a lot of concern about that, partly because it hadn't really been discussed with people and we didn't know exactly what was being expected. So Convoices took somewhat of a lead in all of this, and we put together an issues paper, and then later on another issues paper outlining the problems that we saw with the proposal, and also suggesting some ways forward. At one point in the process, the ministers decided that there were specific issues affecting the specialist sexual violence services, and that group of organisations were separated off, and it was agreed that a separate process would be put in place for them, appropriately recognising that there were specific safety and security issues for the users of those sexual violence services. At the beginning of the year, the Privacy Commissioner instituted an inquiry. A number of concerns had surfaced, including quite publicly, and the Privacy Commissioner took note of those and instituted a quite significant inquiry. The Commissioner reported at the very beginning of April, and for those of you who haven't seen the Privacy Commissioner's report, I suggest you log on to his website and take a look at that, because it's a very good summary of the issues. That was released at the beginning of April. And around the same time of that, it was reported that there had been a security breach with the MSD platform that had been established for the budgeting services and a few others to lodge their data. So that really happened around the same time as the Privacy Commissioner's report was released. And government, which had, I think, up to then been very determined to keep to that July deadline, determined that things were not ready and that they were going to defer the July start date, which I have to say came as a great relief to most community providers. The other part of the announcement that was made jointly by Social Development Minister Antoli and Social Investment Minister Amy Adams was that the Social Investment Unit would take the lead in setting up a social sector data system, that MSD would be part of working with that, and so would NGOs, as well as people like the Privacy Commissioner and Statistics New Zealand. And so I think we would say we have welcomed that particular decision. And in particular, I think there was a lot of relief that we weren't going ahead at the beginning of July with a data collection system. So that's where we're up to today. And what I'm going to do now is to just talk you through what it is that MSD has been looking for us to provide, and what some of the concerns are with that. So for some of you tuning into this webinar, this will be quite familiar because you'll have seen it in your contract or some of the information that's circulating. But for those of you who are not familiar, I'll just quickly recap the specific information that MSD and now Oranga Tamariki is asking providers to share. So 3 groups of data. The first is client demographic data. Name, date of birth, so this is of the individual seeking service from a provider. Name, date of birth, their address, their gender, their ethnicity, their iwi, if that's a relevant factor for them, and their country of birth. The second category relates to the person's dependents. We're asked to provide the number of dependents and the date of birth of the youngest dependent. The third category is around the services that are being accessed. So the program or the service name that the individual is accessing, the start date and the end date of their engagement with that particular service, and the source of referral. So, for example, they may have gone to a budgeting service and then be referred on to a general family counselling service. And so you have to provide the information of where the referral came from. What's not included, just to be really clear about it, is they're not asking for case notes or personal files. So there's a level of detail that's not being sought. It is primarily what is called administrative data. But nonetheless, of course, there are some very significant and concerning things that are being sought in that data collection. Once those requests became apparent, there was a great deal of concern and a lot of discussion and meetings and talk amongst the community organisations, talking with government where they would engage with us. We also heard from professional bodies like the Association of Social Workers, the psychotherapists, the counsellors, and a lot of individual providers raised some very serious concerns about all of this. And I'll just kind of list, I think, sort of the main kind of groupings of concerns about that have got raised. One is that what was being captured into a government database was a lot of information about people who were self-referred. So these are not necessarily people who've had any engagement with a government agency, but are now having to provide their details through to a government database when really their connection is with a community agency, not with a government department. And there is also concern, of course, that not only is their information being provided, but that of their children, whether the children are affected or relevant to the service that their parent is seeking or not. So as you can imagine, there's a high level of concern about that. Another group of concerns centre around the issue of deterrence. So once it becomes known that if you go and see a community organisation, they are going to want to forward your information to the Ministry of Social Development or Oranga Tamariki, whichever it turns out to be. And we've already had some early signs that people would see that as a deterrent and may not actually end up accessing the important services that they might otherwise need. And of course, there are significant problems if that happens. The people most likely to seek help are potentially people most needing to seek help, I should say, are the ones perhaps most likely to not want to become involved with a service if they think their information is going to be sent into a government agency and potentially shared. So that issue of deterrence is a significant one, and it's certainly something we'd like your feedback on. The third group of issues are around ethics and confidentiality, and the Privacy Commissioner's report canvasses this very thoroughly. For many organisations, they have people with professional ethics around confidentiality, and just generally the idea that people come to you expecting confidential service and then you have to forward that information. The next group of issues is around security of data. And of course, trust and confidence is the essential factor there. If you're going to provide your information to a government department, you need to know that it's going to be looked after carefully. You need to know who's going to see it. You need to know how long it's going to be kept, what the conditions are for sharing it. And because none of that information was available, still is not available, that trust and confidence is not there. And of course, the security breach, which was widely reported, proved to be the last straw for ministers as well as providers. So moving to the next slide, and just to sort of summarise from a provider point of view what some of the concerns about this were, essentially the deal here is that NGOs were being asked to hand over people's personal information in return for government funding, and that was to be a contract requirement, or as we put it there, no data and no funding. And of course, there's no way that this does not appear as having the flavour of coercion about it. Yes, of course, it's possible to not sign a contract, but we know that our providers are highly reliant on government funding. So that is, I think, not an equal exchange of power there. Greater concern, of course, would be if that sort of flavour of coercion was to transmit itself to the relationship between providers and individual service users. You know, if you don't give consent for us to hand over your data, we won't get funded for that. And so our overriding concern is about the lack of a clear rationale for why government wanted to do this. It looks like a big data trawl. And Trevor's going to go into this in a bit more detail, but the general flavour we have been given is that the gathering of this data is intended somehow to improve services, to provide information that allows us to target services better and generally to provide better services. We have engaged in discussion. We have seen papers that Trevor got under the Official Information Act, and I can tell you that there is nothing in those papers that, in my view, constitutes a clear rationale for gathering this information. And of course, the critical factor about that is if you do not have a clear understanding of the purpose of collecting the data, you cannot then get informed consent. You have to be able to get individual consent to hand over information to another agency, and without a clear explanation of the purpose of gathering and sharing that information, you can't get informed consent. And I can say that that's a deal breaker for most of our organisations working in social services. So, as I hope I've explained there, there's a whole clutch of issues and problems about that. So we very much welcome the decision that the government took in, I think it was May, to not proceed immediately with this. We think that was a good call of the ministers, and we supported that decision. But I think we need to say that that's simply a reprieve. It's not that the idea has gone away. We've still got big challenges ahead. There are still issues that we need to work through. We still need to understand the reason for the data collection. We need to sort out all the privacy issues. We need to understand all the ethical implications for everyone concerned. We need to know that there are secure protocols for exchanging and holding and storing that information. And last but not least, of course, for providers, this imposes a quite considerable compliance cost. And to date, there has been no suggestion whatsoever that there is going to be any additional funding for community organisations to do all of this work on government's behalf. So lots of stuff to work through. On the positive side, we've been told that NGOs will have direct input to the next stage of work that's going to be led by the Social Investment Agency to develop a social sector data system. And we're also told that that work will involve the Privacy Commissioner and Statistics New Zealand, which I think is of some comfort, because the Privacy Commissioner and Statistics New Zealand, I think, certainly understand all the issues, and we'll be very happy to be working with them. At this stage, we're not able to say exactly how that input is going to be had, but we have been assured that there will be NGOs involved with that work. So one of the useful things that I hope will come out of this webinar is that we can have some discussion with you, and we'll get some ideas about the kinds of issues we should be focusing on during this next stage of work. There's a lot of issues and problems there, so I think the question is, what's the best way to resolve those? What is it that you as providers, people working in the community, want to see come out of the work that we do with Social Investment Agency? So thanks, Jan.
Kia ora, Brenda, and thank you for posing that question to our audience, because I agree that is something that we'd like to ask for your comment on. So if you go to our Facebook discussion group, you'll see that the questions that we ask include what are the possible, what are your concerns at the moment? Are your concerns around the ethics? Is it around the funding? Some of those issues that Brenda has raised, we'd like to hear from you, and also to get a sense of where you think, what are the possible outcomes you would like to see from this process? Brenda, before we move to Garth, this has been quite a good experience this has been a positive example of collaboration, I would say, for Convoices, hasn't it? Would you like to tell us a bit about that, particularly for groups who don't know about Convoices?
Yeah. Thanks, Jan. You're right. It has been a good experience, and I think Convoices is a relatively informal gathering of national organisations and national networks. So my own organisation, Social Service Providers, Trevor's organisation, Community Networks Aotearoa, and there are a number of other groups. So between us, we actually cover really most of the social services that contract with MSD and wider than that. For those of you who may know this, I spent 10 years as a union leader before coming back into the community sector. And one of the things I've learned in that job, and it becomes very apparent here, is that when we work together, when we all stand together and we work closely together and we have a clear purpose in mind, we can be successful and achieve some good outcomes. And I think this has been a really good example of the community sector working together. Working constructively, we've continued to want to work with government and to make this work, because we're not opposed to the idea of data collection. So I think it's been a really good example of collaborative work in the community sector, and long may that continue.
So we're going to take a step back a little. Brenda's given us a fantastic scene setting from the perspectives of providers and their responses on the ground. But let's go back one and have a look at the context to all of this, how this came about, and maybe the larger picture about big data and how we should understand this fitting into our agenda at the moment. Garth, maybe over there in Christchurch, Garth Nowland-Foreman, would you tell us a little bit from your perspective about what's going on at the moment?
So I want to talk about the story so far and go back to look a little bit about what's behind this current incident of seeking personal information, identifiable personal information from social service providers. It's a part of a current trend that has put a big emphasis on big data. And that itself is part of a long-term search for some simple answers that would enable people to manage organisations by numbers. You may have heard the phrase, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. In fact, the elusive search for being able to manage by numbers has been about as successful as the search for the Holy Grail so far. So in this context, Cathy O'Neill has written a book which is provocatively titled The Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. The numbers are powerful things. And she identifies that people have a relationship with mathematics of fear and trust, which is quite unique apart from people's relationship with religion. It's only gods and mathematics that we both fear and trust. And she says this is actually bad for both democracy and fairness, for promoting greater participation and a fairer society. In theory, mathematics is neutral. 2 + 2 should equal 4, regardless of what anyone wishes the answer to be. But in practice, at the advanced level, the mathematical algorithms power can be formulated and tweaked based on whoever has the power to do so. So she particularly highlights the important point that models are opinions embedded in mathematics. And let me say that again slowly. Models are opinions embedded in mathematics. By being hidden in the cloak of mathematics, they are given a false precision and a false objectivity. But really behind them is often just a series of opinions. And they are the opinions, of course, of the people who hold the power to develop these models. And that's reflected in the fact that in New Zealand, most prominent example of trying to collect big data for the useful purpose of predicting who might be the children most at risk so that we could perhaps provide additional services and support for them, highlighted a small number of key indicators, 4 key indicators that seem to account for most of the risk. However, the nature of targeting is that even when you get very good mathematical relationships, you can have lots of false positives and false negatives. And in particular, what that means is that the 35% of the children in New Zealand who indicated all 4 of Treasury's showcase indicators of vulnerability for children go on to live a life with no problems. 35% no problems. That's a false positive. And of course, the reverse can be true as well, where people don't show the indicators of risk but still face positives. So we always need to face these tools with a high degree of skepticism. In fact, the last 6 children, unfortunately, to die of non-accidental injuries did not meet any of the high risk factors identified by these mathematical algorithms. So the more we tie ourselves to relying on them, unfortunately, the further we might end up becoming from the little data of direct knowledge and information that we get from working day to day with people. Cathy O'Neill is not someone who opposes data or statistics. She in fact has a PhD from Harvard in statistics and is an experienced data scientist herself. It's only because of her familiarity with these areas that she's able to argue so forcefully about the deep problems that occur when we have an insufficiently healthy skepticism about what is just another tool and the current fad for another tool. The other important thing to say is that the sector is not anti-data. Non-profit organisations, community groups, charities, NGOs are not anti-data. Despite its limitations, according to the Privacy Commissioner's recent online survey of over 500 NGOs, 92% already collect quite detailed data from their clients for internal use. If you're an organisation providing services, you're probably one of those 92%, so you'll be very familiar with this. And 40% of those already share that information with other service providers, and 34% already share it even with funders. So we are neither opposed to collecting data, using it ourselves, nor sharing it with others when there's a particular need. In fact, if there is an error on the part of non-profits, I think it's that we collect too much data and that we are not focused enough, and in particular, that we have too much emphasis on quantitative data, numbers, and not enough emphasis on qualitative data. This first appeared in some research that I did back in the year 2000 when we piloted social auditing as a tool in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with a small number, admittedly, of organisations, under a dozen across the country. But every one of those organisations in that sample collected more data than they actually needed, and almost all of that was quantitative data, and any gaps that did exist were pretty much the qualitative or descriptive information that was held. We need, in fact, the area that needs the biggest development is better stories, better qualitative information, the little data that gives us the nuanced information that can help us make some really important decisions. As Brenda has already explained, in June 2016, the Ministry for Social Development began rolling out, almost unannounced, on a take it or leave it basis as a part of new contracts, the requirement to provide identifying personal information of clients in order to get funding. It was presented as a fait accompli, without consultation or even much prior notification, apart from in the most general terms. As news spread around the sector, widespread annoyance and discontent and concern began to grow, and a coalition of concern formed around the ComVoices collection of national NGOs that Brenda has described. The Privacy Commissioner was also approached by a number of those NGOs to look at this issue, and the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services put in an official information request to the Ministry for Social Development in October 2016 on what information they had on the gathering and reporting of this individual client level data, their assessment of its impact, and any advice to the ministry from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. After much prompting, documents that are ideally released within 20 days under the Official Information Act were finally received by the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services almost 6 months later. The Ministry for Social Development explained this unusual delay was to ensure they were able to be comprehensive in gathering all the information from many different documents, which makes the thinness of the response. I undertook the, I must say, quite boring task of analysing hundreds of pages of information released under this Official Information Act request. And my conclusion was that this was an intrusive collection. This intrusive data collection had a very thin and dubious justification. In particular, there are three things to say about the information that the Ministry for Social Development released at that time. There was, first of all, very little information to justify what is a fairly intrusive collection. 2 or 3 similar bland sentences were repeated time and time again as the rationale and the methodology and the way in which this information would be used. It was no explanation at all, and really doesn't justify the kind of information collected, which made some of us concerned that there hadn't been a clearly thought through rationale or focus for the collection. The second thing that's quite apparent from the information that was released was that very little consideration appears to have been given to its impact on the community organisations or their clients or potential clients. And finally, only the most informal verbal consultation appears to have occurred with the Officer of the Privacy Commissioner on clearly an issue that is very important on concerning many people's privacy. That consultation was so informal that there were no notes kept that they could release to us. None. Zero. Zilch. So the rationale for this major policy shift in the release papers is very weak. In all of those documents, MSD argue that confidential information identifying individual clients needs to be collected so that it will be clear that results are being purchased, what results are being purchased for different types of clients, in order to ensure the right people are getting the right services. Those bland statements are the ones that are repeated throughout all these various documents. But people who understand the collection of data and statistics have consistently identified that this these objectives do not require the identification of individuals. It can be collected from what's called anonymised information. Yet beyond these generalities, no examples are provided in the documents released under the Official Information Act about how the information would otherwise be used, what questions would be asked of it, what answers might be provided, beyond those same bland statements, to ensure that the right people are getting the right services, which we are also very concerned about. The problem is the wrong information is being collected if that's the question that people want answered. The disclosure of the documents did, however, reveal that some officials had warned the potential for these practices of collecting personal information could deter some of the most vulnerable people from seeking needed help. That same issue that Brenda has identified that NGOs had. The very next week after the Official Information Act papers arrived, at the beginning of April, the Privacy Commissioner's inquiry was also released. And interestingly, its conclusions were essentially the same as we found from our analysis of the Official Information Act papers. The Privacy Commissioner found that MSD provided no real justification for the information it wanted. It found that the way in which the policy changes had been affected risked undermining the trust between individual service users and the NGOs that serve them, including deterring some of those most in need from accessing necessary help. And it identified that this also makes a real risk in that even if the NGOs continue to help those people separately and don't include them in the data collection, it will effectively make them invisible in public policy terms. So the information that was considered to be so important will not be complete. And thus, it was no surprise that the Privacy Commission, in the strongest possible terms for a bureaucrat, insisted that alternative methods be considered for accomplishing the government's goals. And it proposed, for example, having the information collected and analysed by Statistics New Zealand as a part of the wider integrated data infrastructure, very much in line with proposals that had also come from many NGOs and community organisations. To the final slide, David. The initial response to the Privacy Commission's pretty much damning findings and strong recommendations was to still try and bulldoze through the original proposals. But at that very point, and if you don't believe in a God, this might encourage you to do.
So we've just lost Garth briefly there. I'm going to give us a couple of seconds just to see if we can bring him back. Any response from David? Whilst we're waiting to see if Garth comes back, I'm just going to give you, both of our presenters now, a little bit of feedback from the audience, just to say what we're hearing so far. Brenda and Trevor, you may want to comment on this just whilst we're bringing Garth back on, if we can. We'd love to see that last slide, Garth. Essentially, people are saying they need to know more about what the requirements are going to be. So Simon Britton from Te Ōrahau, which is an organisation that we really admire, he says there's real uncertainty about what the requirements will be, what kind of data will be required, how it's required to be transmitted, and of course there are internal implications. We need to make a decision soon within our organisation about what we're going to be gathering if we're to meet these requirements. Likewise, Kay Jones says, need more information about the possible uses of the data, what's going to be collected, and how people will be protected, what's the protection that will be placed around the use of the data. Anonymised and grouped data like census reports are useful, co-designed with NGOs, of course, being at the heart of what makes for good government functions. So you may want to comment on those points. I think we may just be getting Garth back, and it would be great to wait to see if we can get Garth's slides. But Brenda, any comment on those? Oh, the other thing I would say as well to our audience is do keep giving us your responses in the polls, because obviously Garth's all about good data, and we would want to have sufficient data to be robust there. So we'd love to see more responses coming in. Brenda, any comment on those few comments from the audience?
Thanks, Jan. I'm not surprised to hear those comments, and of course uncertainty is exactly the thing that is characterising this whole debate, and I'm certainly not in a position to provide anybody with that certainty. What we've been told is that there's going to be some further work, that the Social Investment Agency is going to lead it, MSD will be part of it, NGOs will be part of it. So it will be good to hear directly from people about those issues that they want to make sure are discussed in that further work. MSD has indicated that there will be potentially contract variations, which will allow people to sort of plan ahead. But of course, you know, we all know that it's not the work of 2 minutes to set up a new data collection system. So, you know, one of the issues that I think we're going to have to talk about is the timeframes for implementing any changes that are made, and also where is the recompense for that? Because it's not cheap stuff to develop a new data collection system. And you know, we have a lot of work to do, and I think it will be very unfortunate if an arbitrary time frame, such as, frankly, that I heard from the Minister of Social Development, that they wanted this work done by the end of the year, so that it could go into contracts. I think that kind of pressure of time frame has contributed to MSD not doing very well in the process so far. So I think another arbitrary time frame will be extraordinarily unhelpful. But mostly, of course, we're really happy to hear from people about the issues that they want to make sure we look at on the way through the next piece of work.
And we hope that there is a role for community research as well. Obviously, there are huge resource implications, but also skills and capability implications for groups who are going to be gathering data in a new way. Indeed. And that's one of the reasons that we've been working so hard on our What Works agenda. Trevor, before we hand over to you, as the organisation really who commissioned a lot of the thinking that Garth's now presenting back to us, and as a really important member of Convoices, we'll just ask Garth Nowland-Foreman if he wants to tell us, Garth, how does it all end? Is it a happy ending or a sad ending? Would you like to just nip back in and present that last slide to us, Garth?
The story is to be continued, I'm afraid, Jan, and Brenda has summarised where we're up to very well, and I'd just like to reinforce that probably the biggest lesson that should be learnt from this is the failure to co-design and collaboratively work with the people on the ground means you get a second-rate result. And we need to make that the normal practice. We have found that an increasing practice with government to consult and collaborate and co-design new programs, new data collection. Unfortunately, there was a significant lapse in here, and I think that was one of the issues that led to some of the problems that have meant, in fact, further delays. So it's a false economy to think you can get things done quickly without taking the time to consult with the people on the ground who are actually have the little data of the day-to-day experience of how these things work out in practice. So it's cool. If it's done seriously and thoroughly, I'm sure we'll get a workable result that doesn't own big data, puts it in its place, but is able to use it to help plan and develop better services for those who need them most.
Thanks, Garth. So no big Warner happy ending for now, but a to be continued, which we hope will, you know, as Brenda has said, it's great to see that government has taken this decision to have a rethink and to involve us in the dialogue. Trevor McGlinchey of the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services, I'd love to hand over to you now and tell us in terms of how the future looks and your take on what's going on at the moment. From your perspective and from your organisation's perspective, Trevor, what do you see?
Oh, kia ora, Jen. Kia ora koutou katoa, nā kaimatakitaki. Kua tai mai ki tō tātou whakāturanga nei. Nō reira, mami kia koutou e pāne i nā piki me nā heki o te ao. huri nei. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Garth, for this lead-up. I think the whole push towards the individual client-level data doesn't sit in a vacuum. And, you know, our sector has been pushing hard, I think, to try to have the value that they provide recognised at the highest levels. And after, what, 8 years, 9 years of no funding increases, we know our organisations are stretched. We know that the needs they are confronting within their communities have grown. And the demands of our government funders for information and support for the value that's being provided has increased as well. However, when we bring these subjects up, we constantly get pushed back on. We constantly get from the Minister of the Day or the Minister of Finance comments like we don't know what we're getting, or if it has any value, when we talk about what it is the community social services sector is providing. They talk about $332 million worth of services, but we don't really know if it's making a difference. And that little statement underneath the green writing, the government has made a significant investment in services for these vulnerable New Zealanders. Yet we don't know how effective these services are, and we are still seeing poor outcomes. I got that statement by just Googling that we don't know what we're getting or if it has any value and seeing what popped up. And so from Budget 2016, we see that statement. Somehow the poor outcomes achieved by vulnerable New Zealanders in an environment of benefits that have consistently not met living standards, of housing that is stretched and people living in very poor housing, overcrowding, homeless. Somehow those are the sorts of things our stretched community services sector is supposed to be able to overcome with no increase in funding and no additional support. So for me, the drive for individual client level data is one of saying, how do we understand what we are getting from this investment from a government perspective, and thinking about that in the terms of individuals, not community change, not change in society, not in the social level change that often needs to occur to kind of overcome poor outcomes, but at an individual level, who's getting services and is it making the changes that are required? And I think we've had some conversation about the dangers of trying to understand that from an individual perspective rather than from that bigger perspective. However, we also recognise that data is important, that data makes a difference. And so if we roll on to the next slide, we think about social service organisations. Garth mentioned that 92% of our social services organisations are collecting data. So why do we collect data? And I think one of the principal reasons we collect data is about reflective practice. Whether that's from an individual level, who are we working with? What difference are we making with these individuals? What differences are we making in our communities? At an organisational level, are we actually pushing our organisation to achieve our mission? Are we trying to make the differences in our community within society that we were established to do? I think they're really important reasons to collect data and to reflect on what that data is telling us. We go into the sort of organisational management, and often that's the driver why people actually get engaged with collecting data sometimes in the first place, although they obviously understand and learn from that there are more reasons to do it. But reporting performance to government becomes, to governance. So are we being able to use our data to go back to our boards, to our councils, to our trusts to say, hey, look, this is this is what we're doing, this is how well we're doing it. But often a bigger driver, indeed, for that is, have we achieved the things that we're being funded for? And in that context, you're kind of saying, yes, we've delivered the amount of things we've done, we were contracted for. Often we've delivered more than the amount of things that we've been contracted for, and we've made a difference, and this is how we can demonstrate it. And hopefully by doing that, we secure more funding for the future. I think there's a third reason that we're only just starting to come to grips with, and that's about social justice. You know, as community-based social service organisations, we're there not to just address the band-aids that need to be applied because people are living in poor homes, because people don't have enough income to buy food or to maintain the energy that they need within their homes to keep them warm and safe. So what we want to say is, can we gather data that actually supports changes in policy or process? Can we gather data that might support us to advocate for structural change? That's something I think that we're just starting to get our head around at the moment, starting to think about. So rather than being driven to gather data because this is what the government needs or this is what a funder requires, what is the data that we can gather that makes a difference for us all? So in that context, we've got government come out and said, oh, we need individual client level data. And that kind of individual context, I think, is really important. They're saying, you know, we want to see the difference that you make for an individual. They have changed their phrasing a little bit now. You see them more saying CLD rather than ICLD. So they're saying client level data rather than just individual client level data. But it is a very individualised approach in the context of predictive risk modelling, in the context of, has the investment we've made today actually saved government in 5 years or 10 years some money, and trying to measure that against those predictive risk modelling factors and then stretching out over time. Have they cost less than what we predicted back in the day? But however, what MSD says, that individual client level data will help them to understand who is using the programs, what services they fund, and what impacts those programs and services are having. It will help them understand the needs of the clients and the types of services that are likely to work. Questionable. It will help them better identify target groups of programs and services and service users, and understand if a program or service is effective. So MSD, you know, if you go onto their website right now, you'll still see that those statements sitting there. However, after that Privacy Commission report and after the breach of privacy that occurred, the Minister of Social Development came out and said something else. And if we roll on to the next slide, and there's a bit of a radio clip here that David's going to play for us.
And listening to that is the Minister of Social Development, Anne Tolley. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Guy.
The Privacy Commissioner says that as implemented, this would be inconsistent with the principles of the Privacy Act and therefore it should be changed. Will it be changed?
Well, I think he's made 4 recommendations, really. And listening to him, look, I absolutely agree. If we were just looking for the effectiveness of programs, then anonymised data can do that. Now, it's important. If Statistics New Zealand or someone else was collecting it, as he's suggesting, and it was anonymised, yep, if that's all we were looking for, I agree with him, that would be fine. But actually, we want to do more than that. And it's about coverage. It's about making sure, because we know that many people are getting services from a number of NGOs, and I'm really concerned that we also know that there are vulnerable families out there that are getting no services from NGOs. So in order to make sure that we have coverage, that there's no duplication and there's no gaps, we need to know who those NGOs are working with, so that we can make sure that everyone is getting, all vulnerable families are getting access to the services that the government and the taxpayer provides.
Thank you. Shall we roll on to the next slide? So for me, some of the key points that came out of that was that the Minister agreed with the Privacy Commissioner that if they were only looking at the effectiveness of the programs, then anonymised data would do that. That kind of goes from we need individual client level data to see how effective the programs are to actually no, we don't. But what we do have is something that the Ministry of Social Development didn't talk about, which was to say actually we need to gather individual data to make sure that there's coverage and no duplication. So where perhaps an individual is receiving services from 2 or 3 service providers, we might be able to stop them getting services from 2 of those, and they only get a service from 1. And then those other 2 can go and look for someone else to work with so that we get improved coverage. I think we need to really think that through and unpack that an awful lot more. You know, are those 3 organisations or 4 organisations, specialist services collaborating around an individual or in fact a family and able to provide the wraparound services that many whānau need in this environment? So that's sort of some of the thinking that we have, we need to do. And you can see the desire from government to get the information, the data they want, which gives them this simplistic solution. Is there duplication? Have we got coverage? All of those kinds of things. But it's actually an awful lot deeper than that, requires quite a lot more thinking. And these kind of simplistic solutions can have serious unintended consequences if we don't work through, think through, and come up with processes that make real sense. And I think what we do have to reflect, though, is the Minister has identified that the anonymised data collection will demonstrate whether or not a service is effective or not. From our own reflective practice, we want to know we're effective. Government wants to know we're effective. Let's work together around those sorts of things and think about how do we make the biggest difference to the whānau we work with. So moving on to my last slide. For me, I've been thinking about this as a watershed moment, and what I mean by a watershed moment is in 3, 4, 5 years, we'll look back to when we've moved from a sort of more community-based approach to this more individualised approach, from more gathering data about how effective we are to actually gathering individual data, that we'll see that there's been a real change, that our community social services sector went through a major change at that point. And I guess I get concerned, without trying to hang on to the past, but I get concerned that we'll lose a lot of the good things that we're already doing as we move into this brave new data-informed world. And that, I've kind of framed them up here as kind of changing from a community-based service provider addressing local need to this individual-based provider meeting individual needs, but only when the specific criteria are met. People will come in and say, I've got these problems, but if they don't meet the kind of predictive risk modelling criteria that government sets, we might have to tell them to go away until they actually get sick enough, until they actually reach a point where they meet this particular criteria. So we're not kind of just reaching into our communities and helping our communities and the people living in them to make the changes that make them healthier and have greater well-being. So we stop being highly trusted organisations delivering confidential support to almost a quasi-government organisation who deliver services to targeted individuals, to customers. And then we're reporting back to government who they are and what their needs are. And that really becomes quite a different organisation, quite a different operating environment. And from a community perspective, it doesn't feel right. From a community perspective, it feels like it's steering us in the wrong direction. We're not quasi-government organisations. We try to work with the needs that our community present us. Those needs are complex, they're multifaceted. Some of them can be measured by 4 predictive risk model factors. Many of them can't. But they also, as Garth said, just because you can't measure them by a predictive risk model doesn't mean that in the longer term they don't significantly reduce the well-being of our community and the people that live in them. We need to be able to work with what's in front of us in a trusted and a caring way. And we need to promote social structural responses that lead to social justice. So, kia ora tātou. Koe nei aku whakaaro e pāni tēnei kaupapa. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Trevor. Ngā mahi nui ki a koe mo o whakaaro ki a mātou. This just about brings us to the end of our community research webinar, as this is a 1-hour event today, but we're about to jump onto the Facebook page where Brenda, Trevor and Garth will be in the discussion group and they're waiting to take your questions. So we will continue that conversation. And Lasse, will you give Brenda a quick ring to guide her to that page? I just want to say that community research is interested in the research which is good for community. We recognise the value of those whole of community picture, Trevor, which you were just describing there. Please join us for Please join us for our next event, which is 15th of August. Sharon Shea will be presenting on RBA and how to use your RBA to making sense of your data, I think is her third topic. And we're just going to show you a quick video, which is about the community research website, making use of the community research website. And we'll see you on Facebook in just a moment. Come with your questions and we'll continue the conversation there. Orera, tēnā rā, koutou katoa.
The Community Research website offers a hub for good community research and researchers. It's the place for the public to find and share evidence about effective community practices. The website collects research and evidence and organises these so that they can be easily accessed and used by other groups. You can access this research and browse by category, by a list of quick link topics, or by searching for something specific. All of the research is free to download. The Community Research site is all about excellence and effective practices. You can view recordings of past webinars and find out about future ones. The webinars share evidence about what's working in the community sector. Published by Community Research in 2007, the Code of Practice provides the standards and guidelines for doing research. It's the place to start if you're thinking of undertaking research with or in a community or iwi. As well as the collection of research, we keep a register of experienced researchers who are skilled at working with iwi and communities. To find a researcher who can help you, we have a filter system which allows you to find people based on location, qualification, ethnic group, and area of expertise. The Community Research website is a unique resource for the community sector to use and share. It matters because communities who learn well will do well. It matters because it evidences what's working for us. For researchers and community people alike, we've made it as easy as possible to share your research on our website. Kaua e whakamā. Uploading material is quick and simple. Save your work as a PDF and head over to Share Research. Answer a few questions that help us tag and organise the research so it's easy for people to find. If you're a researcher and skilled at working with communities, you can add your details to the directory of researchers so that you can be found. Community research keeps you updated and informed. This helps make you more effective. If you want to stay updated about the latest research, informed about new resources and our upcoming webinars, head over to sign up for our e-news on the homepage. Community research is a rich resource built for and by the community. For it to reach maximum potential, we rely on you to contribute, participate, and support the resource to grow and thrive. Mā te kotahitanga e ora ai tātou.